Some nights become history because the whole world is watching. Others become history because no one is. There were no photographers waiting outside. No flashing cameras. No reporters fighting for the perfect headline. No screaming fans pressing against the gates. Only a quiet California evening. And a silence so deep that it seemed to swallow every sound around it. Years later, people would remember the songs. They would remember the records. They would remember the concerts that shook entire cities. But almost no one would know about the strange silence that waited behind one front door. The silence that greeted the four most famous musicians in the world. The Beatles had conquered nearly everything music could offer. Every airport became a battlefield of excitement. Every hotel was surrounded by thousands of devoted fans. Every concert felt less like a performance and more like an earthquake. Newspapers called them a phenomenon. Critics called them revolutionary. Millions simply called them heroes. But long before anyone had called them legends, they had been four ordinary boys from Liverpool. Four boys who stayed awake long after midnight, listening to worn-out records until the needle scratched across the vinyl. One voice kept returning. Strong, confident, unmistakable. Elvis Presley. Before the screaming crowds. Before the sold-out arenas. Before history knew the name the Beatles. There had been Elvis. His music had done something impossible. It didn't simply entertain. It gave young dreamers permission to believe that ordinary people could change the world with nothing more than a guitar and enough courage to stand under a spotlight. For John Lennon, Elvis represented rebellion. For Paul McCartney, he represented musical perfection. For George Harrison, he represented endless possibility. For Ringo Starr, he represented joy. Each of them carried a different reason for admiring him. Yet they all shared the same dream. One day, they hoped they might simply shake his hand. Life, however, had a strange sense of humor. Dreams rarely arrived the way people imagined. Success came faster than any of them expected. One hit became another. One tour became another continent. One year became another impossible chapter in music history. Almost overnight, they found themselves living inside a storm that never seemed to end. Everywhere they went, people reached toward them. Some wanted an autograph. Others wanted a photograph. Many simply wanted proof that these four young men were real. Fame surrounded them every hour of every day. And yet, there remained one person whose opinion still mattered more than every cheering crowd combined. Not because he held power over them. Not because he could make or break their careers. But because every artist remembers the person who first inspired them to dream. Then came the invitation. Simple, private, unexpected. A meeting. No press. No publicity. Just musicians sharing an evening together. For a long moment, no one said anything. John read the message twice before quietly placing it back on the table. Paul stared at it as if it might disappear. George folded his arms, thoughtful. Ringo broke the silence with a nervous grin. So, he looked around the room. This is actually happening. Nobody laughed. Not because the joke wasn't funny. Because the reality suddenly felt much larger than anyone had imagined. It was strange. The Beatles had stood before audiences larger than entire towns. They had performed through deafening screams so loud they could barely hear themselves play. They had faced critics, pressure, impossible expectations. Yet somehow, meeting one man felt more intimidating than facing a stadium filled with strangers. As the day approached, each of them prepared differently. John buried his nerves beneath quick wit. Paul disappeared into his guitar for hours, chasing tiny details no audience would ever notice. George found comfort in quiet practice, letting familiar chords steady his thoughts. Ringo tried to keep everyone's spirits high, but even he sensed something unusual hanging in the air. No one admitted it aloud. Each wondered the same thing. What if our hero isn't the man we've imagined? That question lingered like an unanswered note. The morning of the visit arrived with surprising calm. California looked beautiful. The sun drifted lazily across a cloudless sky. Palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze. Traffic moved without urgency. It seemed impossible that somewhere in this peaceful city, history was quietly waiting. The drive felt longer than it truly was. Inside the car, conversation came in short bursts before fading away. John watched the passing streets without saying much. Paul absent-mindedly tapped silent rhythms against his leg. George rested one hand on the guitar case beside him. Ringo glanced from face to face. "I've seen us before big concerts," he finally said softly. "This feels different." No one argued. Because he was right. Concerts could be rehearsed. This couldn't. Eventually the car slowed. Tall gates appeared ahead. Beyond them stood a beautiful home, surrounded by trees that seemed determined to keep the outside world away. It didn't look like the home of an untouchable icon. It looked peaceful, almost ordinary. The gates opened slowly. The car rolled forward over the gravel driveway. Each crunch beneath the tires sounded strangely loud. As they stepped outside, the evening air felt unexpectedly still. No fans. No excitement. Only the distant sound of birds settling into the trees. For the first time in years, the Beatles weren't walking toward a stage. They were walking toward the man who had unknowingly changed their lives. John adjusted his jacket. Paul took a slow breath. George glanced at the front door. Ringo quietly whispered, "Ready." No one answered, because none of them truly knew. John stepped forward. His hand rose toward the door. For one brief second, he hesitated. How many times had he imagined this moment? How many conversations had existed only inside his imagination? How many thank you speeches had quietly disappeared before ever being spoken? His knuckles finally touched the wood. 3 gentle knocks echoed through the house. Silence answered. Then, footsteps. Slow, measured, growing closer. Each step somehow made the silence even heavier. The door opened. Standing there was Elvis Presley. For years, they had imagined this first meeting. A smile, a laugh, a warm welcome. Perhaps even an embrace between musicians who understood one another. Instead, Elvis simply looked at them. His expression revealed almost nothing. His eyes moved from one face to the next with calm curiosity. No excitement. No performance. No greeting for the cameras, because there were none. Only a quiet moment between 5 men who understood better than anyone what fame could demand. Several long seconds passed. No one spoke. The silence stretched until it became almost physical. Then Elvis gave the smallest nod. He turned, and without a single welcoming word, he walked deeper into the house. The Beatles exchanged uncertain glances. No instructions. No celebration. Only an open doorway. And the feeling that the evening ahead would become something none of them had expected. They followed, not as the biggest band in the world, but as 4 young musicians. walking behind the man who had first taught them that music could change a life. And before the night was over, they would discover that even legends carry burdens no audience can see. The hallway stretched farther than any of them had expected. Family photographs lined the walls. Gold records reflected the fading light from the windows. There were trophies, awards, memories. Yet none of those things seemed to matter at that moment. The only sound inside the house was the quiet rhythm of footsteps across the polished wooden floor. Elvis never looked back. Not once. He simply walked at an unhurried pace, as though he expected them to understand exactly where they were going. The four young men followed in silence. For perhaps the first time in years, none of them felt like celebrities. John glanced briefly toward Paul. Paul answered with the smallest shrug. George lowered his eyes. Ringo folded his hands behind his back, unusually quiet. Every passing second made the silence heavier. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was unpredictable. Finally, Elvis stopped. He rested one hand on a wooden door before slowly pushing it open. The room beyond was larger than they had imagined. Sunlight slipped through half-closed curtains, painting long golden lines across the floor. Against one wall stood shelves filled with records from artists around the world. In another corner sat a piano that looked as though it had witnessed countless late-night melodies. But none of those things captured their attention. In the very center of the room, 5 guitars rested in a loose circle. Waiting. No microphones. No amplifiers. No audience. No stage. Just 5 chairs. 5 instruments. And silence. Elvis stepped into the room and gently rested his hand on the back of one chair. Only then did he finally turn to face them. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. His eyes moved from John to Paul, to George, to Ringo. For several long moments he said nothing. The room felt almost suspended in time. Then, in a quiet voice that carried far more weight than its volume suggested, he finally spoke. So, he glanced toward the guitars. They tell me the whole world can't stop talking about you. No one answered immediately. John smiled politely, though it barely hid the tension on his face. Paul instinctively straightened his jacket. George remained perfectly still. Ringo quietly shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Elvis continued. I've heard your records. Another pause. They're different. No explanation followed. Different. Was that praise? Or criticism? None of them could tell. Then Elvis nodded toward the guitars. Let's leave the newspapers outside. His voice remained steady. No headlines. No managers. No fans. Just music. The words settled over the room like dust. It wasn't an interview. It wasn't a publicity event. It wasn't even a meeting between famous people. It was something much simpler. And somehow, far more intimidating. John slowly reached for the nearest guitar. His fingers wrapped around the neck almost automatically. The familiar weight usually brought confidence. Today, it brought responsibility. Paul chose another instrument, quietly checking its tuning before sitting down. George carefully lifted a beautiful guitar that had clearly been played often. Its finish showed tiny marks left by years of music. Ringo settled into the final chair, resting his hands comfortably as he looked around the circle. Elvis picked up the last guitar. No announcement. No countdown. Only 5 musicians facing one another. For several seconds, nobody played. Outside those walls, millions believed these men possessed limitless confidence. Inside this quiet room, each of them waited for someone else to begin. Finally, Elvis struck a single chord. Warm, rich, unhurried. The sound floated through the room before disappearing into silence once more. John answered with another chord. Paul quietly added harmony. George joined with gentle precision. Without drums, without cheering crowds, without lights, music began to breathe. At first, every note carried caution. Every chord felt measured. Every glance drifted back toward Elvis, searching for some small sign of approval. A smile, a nod, anything. But Elvis revealed nothing. His face remained calm. His attention never wandered. He wasn't listening like a fan. He was listening like a musician. The kind of listening that notices every hesitation, every moment of confidence, every unspoken emotion hidden between the notes. Minutes passed. Then something remarkable happened. The nervousness began to fade. No one had planned it. No one even noticed the exact moment. The music slowly stopped feeling like a performance. John stopped trying to impress. Paul stopped worrying about perfection. George stopped overthinking every phrase. Ringo relaxed, letting instinct guide the rhythm. The room itself seemed to change. There were no longer global icons sitting together. Only 5 men who had each fallen in love with music long before the world learned their names. Outside, the world saw legends. Inside, they were simply artists chasing the next beautiful note. And for the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared on Elvis's face. It lasted only a heartbeat. Yet all 4 of them noticed. Without a single word, the atmosphere changed. Whatever test they had imagined, perhaps it was never about fame at all. The music drifted through the room without urgency. No one was trying to prove anything anymore. One melody gave way to another. Sometimes Elvis led. Sometimes Paul quietly found a harmony that seemed to complete the phrase before it had fully formed. George answered with delicate guitar lines that floated between the chords like a conversation. John added rough edges that somehow made everything feel more honest. Even without a full drum kit, Ringo tapped a gentle rhythm against the side of his chair, reminding everyone that sometimes the simplest beat was enough. No one spoke. There was no need. For musicians, there are moments when words only interrupt. This was one of them. Outside those walls, newspapers loved to compare artists. Who sold more records? Who filled bigger stadiums? Who would be remembered forever? Inside that room, none of those questions mattered. There was only the music. The final chord slowly faded into silence. No one reached for another song. No one rushed to fill the quiet. Elvis carefully rested his guitar against the chair beside him. He folded his hands together for a moment, looking down at the wooden floor. Then he raised his eyes. They'll always ask who's bigger. His voice was calm. So don't waste your life trying to answer that question. The Beatles remained silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they wanted to hear more. Elvis leaned back slightly. The crowds change. The headlines change. The world's favorite sound changes. He looked toward the window, where the last light of evening was beginning to disappear. But if you start making music because you're afraid of losing those crowds. He paused. You've already lost something much more important. The words settled over the room. John slowly lowered his eyes. For weeks, journalists had been asking the same question. Are the Beatles changing? Can they stay on top? How long can Beatlemania last? Questions like those followed them everywhere. Questions they pretended not to hear. Yet somehow, hearing those same fears reflected by the man who had inspired them carried a different weight. Paul finally spoke. It's difficult. His voice was almost hesitant. Sometimes it feels like people expect every new song to be bigger than the last. Elvis nodded. I know. Just 2 words. Simple. Honest. There was no speech. No dramatic advice. Only the quiet understanding of someone who had stood beneath the same impossible expectations. George gently rested both hands on his guitar. Does it ever become easier? The room fell silent again. Elvis smiled faintly. A tired smile. The kind that comes from remembering something you wish you could forget. You learn to live with it. Another pause. But you never stop hearing the noise. No one asked what he meant. They already understood. Because fame had its own sound. It wasn't applause. It wasn't music. It was the constant feeling that the entire world expected something from you every single day. The expectation never slept. It followed you onto airplanes, into restaurants, into hotel rooms. Even home was no longer completely quiet. Ringo looked around the room. For the first time, he noticed how peaceful the house actually was. There were no assistants rushing through the hallway. No reporters outside the windows. No photographers hiding behind the trees. It suddenly occurred to him that perhaps this silence wasn't accidental. Perhaps it was something Elvis protected. John slowly broke the silence. When we were younger, he smiled to himself. We used to imagine what this day would be like. Elvis looked at him with quiet curiosity. John laughed softly. We thought we'd spend the whole evening asking questions. Paul smiled. I think we've barely asked any. Elvis chuckled for the first time that evening. A genuine laugh. Small. Warm. Almost unexpected. Sometimes, he said, the best conversations happen after people stop trying to impress each other. The tension that had filled the room since the front door opened finally disappeared. The 5 men were no longer carrying the weight of their reputations. They were simply sharing stories. They spoke about the first guitars they had owned, the songs they wished they had written, the performances that had gone wonderfully, and the ones they wished everyone would forget. Laughter slowly replaced nervousness. Hours seemed to pass unnoticed. Outside, darkness settled across the quiet California neighborhood. Inside, time no longer felt important. Eventually, Elvis stood and walked toward a nearby record player. He gently placed a record onto the turntable. Soft music filled the room. Not to perform. Not to impress. Only to listen. The 5 musicians sat without speaking. Each lost in his own thoughts. Each remembering a different beginning. In that quiet moment, something changed. The Beatles had arrived hopping to meet a legend. Instead, they had begun meeting the man behind the legend. And they were beginning to realize that greatness was far less glamorous than the world imagined. Behind every standing ovation, there was sacrifice. Behind every headline, there was pressure. Behind every smiling photograph, there were moments of doubt no camera could ever capture. None of them knew it yet. But before the night was over, one deeply personal confession would leave the room completely silent. And it would become the one memory they would carry long after the songs had faded. The room remained quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels awkward. the kind that only exists between people who no longer feel the need to impress one another. Outside, the California night had completely settled. The last traces of sunlight had disappeared beyond the hills. Only a warm lamp in the corner of the room illuminated the 5 musicians. Its soft glow stretched long shadows across the wooden floor. For a while, no one spoke. The record continued spinning quietly in the background, filling the room with gentle music that seemed almost afraid to interrupt the moment. John leaned back in his chair. He looked around the room. There were no bodyguards, no managers, no assistants reminding anyone of tomorrow's schedule, no reporters waiting to turn every sentence into tomorrow's headline. For the first time in what felt like years, they were simply 5 musicians. Nothing more, nothing less. Elvis slowly stood and walked toward the window. He looked outside for several long seconds before speaking. "You know," his voice was almost a whisper, "the strange thing about fame," he paused, "is that everyone thinks it feels like winning." No one interrupted. "But nobody tells you how lonely winning can become." The words settled heavily over the room. Paul lowered his eyes. George gently rested his fingers across the strings of his guitar. Even Ringo, usually ready with a joke, remained completely still. Elvis continued looking into the darkness beyond the glass. "When I was younger, I thought success would solve every problem." He smiled faintly. "It solved some. Then it created new ones." He slowly turned back toward them. The louder the applause became, the quieter life felt afterward. John looked at him carefully. For years he had watched Elvis on television. Confident, fearless, always in control. He had never imagined hearing words like these. Paul finally asked the question that had quietly lived inside his mind all evening. "Do you ever get used to people expecting you to be perfect?" Elvis let out a slow breath. "No." The answer came instantly. "No matter how many records you sell, no matter how many people cheer, someone always expects more." He walked back toward the circle of chairs. "You finish one great performance. They ask when the next one is. You make one unforgettable record. They ask whether you'll ever do it again. You become successful. They expect you to stay there forever." He looked around the room. The world loves success, but it rarely understands what success costs. No one argued, because every man in that room had already begun paying that price. George quietly spoke. "Sometimes I miss being unknown." The sentence surprised everyone, including George himself. He had not planned to say it aloud. But once the words escaped, there was no taking them back. "I miss walking through a city without anyone watching. I miss sitting somewhere without wondering whether someone is taking my photograph." Elvis nodded slowly. "I know. I miss that too." Ringo smiled sadly. "My mother used to tell me, don't forget to enjoy life while you're chasing your dreams." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know when I stopped doing that." Silence returned. Not empty silence. Honest silence. The kind that follows truth. John finally spoke. "When Beatlemania started, I thought the excitement would last forever." He laughed quietly. "It did. But I never imagined being unable to hear myself think." Everyone smiled, because they understood exactly what he meant. Screaming crowds, endless travel, hotel rooms that all looked the same, cities blending together, until one morning you woke up unsure which country you were in. People saw glamour. They lived exhaustion. Elvis looked toward the guitars again. Do you know why I wanted tonight to be private? Nobody answered. Because the world has already met Elvis Presley. He smiled gently. They've met the performer. They've met the photographs. They've met the headlines. His smile slowly disappeared. But very few people ever meet Elvis. The room became completely still. For a brief moment, the king of rock and roll wasn't speaking. A man was. A man who had spent years carrying expectations too heavy for anyone to notice. Paul leaned forward. I think. He searched carefully for the right words. People forget we're still learning. They think once you're successful, you stop being human. Elvis looked directly at him. No. They stop allowing you to be human. Those words landed harder than anyone expected. John looked toward the floor. George slowly closed his eyes. Ringo stared quietly into the distance. Because every one of them had experienced exactly that. Every mistake became front-page news. Every rumor spread across continents. Every ordinary moment became public property. Success had given them everything they once dreamed about. And quietly, it had taken away things they never imagined losing. Time, privacy, peace. For several minutes no one spoke. The ticking of a nearby clock became the loudest sound in the house. Then Elvis stood. He walked toward a small shelf and picked up an old acoustic guitar. Its finish was worn. Tiny scratches covered the wood. It wasn't valuable because it was perfect. It was valuable because it had been played. He carried it back to the circle, holding it carefully, almost affectionately. This, he said softly, is the guitar I still reach for when nobody's watching. John smiled. It isn't your newest. No. It isn't the most expensive either. No. Then why this one? Elvis gently brushed his fingers across the faded wood. Because this guitar remembers who I was. Before the world decided who I should become. No one spoke. Those words needed no explanation. Every artist begins with love. Then comes ambition. Then success. Then pressure. The hardest part is finding your way back to that first love. Elvis looked at each of them, one by one. Promise yourselves something. His voice was calm. When the crowds become louder, listen harder to the quiet. When the business becomes bigger, protect the reason you started. And when people begin treating you like legends. He paused. Don't forget how to remain musicians. No applause followed. No dramatic music. Only silence. But it was the kind of silence that changes people. Long after records stop spinning. Long after concerts end. Long after crowds go home. Some conversations remain. This was becoming one of them. None of the 5 men realized it yet. But before the night ended, one final exchange at the front door would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And years later, when the world remembered only the photographs, they would remember the silence. For a long while, no one reached for another guitar. No one felt the need to. The music had already said what words could not. Outside, the wind gently moved through the trees surrounding the house. Inside, the silence had become something entirely different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of understanding. Elvis slowly walked toward a small table in the corner of the room. 5 glasses waited there. He quietly poured each of them a drink before returning to the circle. No speeches. No ceremony. Just a simple gesture. He handed one to John, another to Paul, then George, then Ringo. Finally, he sat down with his own. For several moments, they simply held the glasses in their hands, almost as if no one wanted to be the first person to interrupt the night. John finally broke the silence. When we were kids, he smiled to himself. We thought success looked glamorous. Paul laughed softly. We imagined expensive cars, big houses, people cheering everywhere we went. Ringo shook his head. No one tells you about the airports. Everyone laughed. The hotels. George added. The endless interviews. Paul smiled. The questions you've answered 1,000 times. John looked at Elvis. And the strange feeling that people know your face, but never really know you. Elvis slowly nodded. They fall in love with an image. They applaud a version of you. But the real person, he looked into his glass, has to find somewhere quiet just to remember who he is. The room became still again. No one disagreed, because every one of them had experienced that feeling. There were days when they could barely leave a building. Days when thousands waited outside from sunrise until midnight. Days when even a short walk became impossible. Millions loved them, yet very few actually knew them. Elvis leaned forward. Tell me something. If tomorrow morning, every record disappeared, every newspaper forgot your name, and every crowd stopped screaming. He looked at each of them. Would you still play? The question hung in the air. No one answered immediately. It wasn't because they didn't know. It was because the answer mattered. John was first. I would. He smiled quietly. I'd probably complain while doing it. A few gentle laughs filled the room. But I'd still play. Paul nodded. I don't think I could stop. George rested one hand across the guitar beside him. I'd play even if no one ever listened again. Ringo grinned. I'd still annoy the neighbors. The room erupted into genuine laughter. Even Elvis laughed harder than anyone had heard all evening. For the first time since they had arrived, there were no legends inside the room. Only friends. When the laughter faded, Elvis looked around the circle. Good. Never lose that answer. He stood once more and slowly walked toward the shelves filled with records. His fingers drifted across dozens of albums. Some had changed music forever. Others had quietly disappeared into history. He finally stopped. You know something strange. Without turning around, he continued. The world remembers songs. It remembers awards. It remembers headlines. He looked back over his shoulder. But it almost never remembers the nights that created them. His eyes settled on the four musicians. Those are the moments that matter. The quiet rehearsals. The doubts. The failures. The conversations no audience ever hears. He smiled. Those are the moments that build legends. No one spoke. Because deep down, they knew he was right. Fans would never see this room. No reporter would describe this conversation. No magazine would print these words. History would record that Elvis Presley met the Beatles. But history would never fully capture what happened inside these walls. The clock quietly struck another hour. No one had noticed how late it had become. Outside, the neighborhood was asleep. Inside, the conversation continued. They spoke about family, about childhood, about the first time each of them had stepped onto a stage with trembling hands. They laughed over forgotten mistakes. They admitted fears they had never shared in interviews. Every story peeled away another layer of fame, until only 5 ordinary men remained. Then, without warning, Elvis grew quiet again. His smile slowly faded. He looked toward the guitars resting against their chairs. His voice, when it finally returned, was softer than before. "You know, I sometimes wonder whether people clap for the music, or because they're afraid the magic might disappear." No one answered, because no one had an answer. John noticed something in Elvis's eyes that hadn't been there earlier that evening. Not sadness, not regret, something deeper. The quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent years carrying expectations that never became lighter. For the first time that night, the Beatles no longer saw the king of rock and roll. They saw a man who had given the world unforgettable music, while quietly sacrificing pieces of himself that no audience could ever replace. That realization changed everything. The admiration they had carried into the house remained, but it had transformed into something greater. Respect, not for the legend, but for the human being behind the legend. None of them realized it then, but when they finally stood to leave before dawn, one simple sentence at the front door would stay with them for the rest of their lives, and become the true ending of a night the world would never completely understand. The conversation drifted naturally from music to life, then from life to fear. It happened so quietly that none of them noticed when the subject changed. One moment they were laughing about forgotten concerts. The next, they were speaking about the invisible weight that followed every famous name. The lamp in the corner was now the only light left in the room. Its warm glow softened the walls, leaving much of the house hidden in shadow. Outside, the world slept peacefully. Inside, 5 men remained awake, sharing thoughts they had never expected to say aloud. Elvis slowly leaned back. For several long moments, he simply stared at the ceiling. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something different. Not confidence, not sadness, acceptance. "People think fame changes you." He smiled faintly. "I don't believe that." The Beatles listened without moving. "I think fame does something else. It removes every place you can hide." No one interrupted. "If you're lonely, the whole world watches you being lonely. If you're tired, the whole world expects you to keep smiling. If you're afraid, you learn very quickly never to show it." John slowly folded his arms. Those words reached somewhere deep inside him. He remembered standing backstage before concerts. Thousands of voices roaring outside. Managers counting down the seconds. Band members pretending everything was normal. And yet, there were nights when he wondered if he had enough strength to walk onto the stage. No one ever knew, because no one was supposed to know. Paul quietly looked toward the floor. He thought about the endless pressure of writing another song, another melody, another masterpiece. Every success only raised the expectations higher. George remembered the rare moments when he could be completely alone with a guitar. Those moments had become precious, almost impossible to find. Ringo remembered the laughter. People always expected him to be the cheerful one. Very few ever wondered whether he felt exhausted too. Elvis looked around the circle. "You see, the audience only meets us for 2 hours. They never see the journey before the curtain rises. They never see the silence after the applause ends." He slowly stood and walked toward the window once again. The moonlight reflected softly across the glass. "When the crowd goes home," He spoke without turning around. That's when the real conversation begins. The conversation you have with yourself. He paused. And sometimes, that conversation is the hardest one of all. The room became completely still. No guitar strings vibrated. No clock seemed to tick. Even the wind outside had faded. It felt as though the entire night itself had stopped to listen. John finally broke the silence. When I was younger, I believed heroes had all the answers. A gentle smile crossed Elvis's face. So did I. They both laughed quietly. A laugh filled not with amusement, but understanding. Paul looked toward Elvis. I think tonight has surprised all of us. Elvis raised an eyebrow. How so? Paul hesitated. We came here expecting to meet. He searched for the right words. The king of rock and roll. He smiled warmly. But we've spent the evening talking to someone who understands exactly what we're going through. Elvis looked down for a moment. Then he nodded. Maybe that's because crowns are heavy. No one spoke. The sentence was simple. Yet every man in the room understood it immediately. Fame had given each of them a crown. Invisible, magnificent, and unbearably heavy. The fire of conversation slowly gave way to another long silence. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because every important word had already found its place. At last, Elvis reached for his guitar one final time. Without asking, without announcing, he played a slow progression of chords. John quietly joined him. Then Paul. George followed with a gentle melody. Ringo tapped the rhythm softly against the arm of his chair. No audience would ever hear what they played that night. No recording captured it. No newspaper described it. The melody existed only in that room. For those few precious minutes. And then it disappeared forever. Perhaps that was what made it beautiful. When the final chord faded into silence, no one moved. No one wanted to be the first to admit that the night was coming to an end. Elvis carefully placed his guitar back in its stand. He looked around the room one last time. I'm glad you came. It was the warmest thing he had said all evening. John smiled. So are we. No applause followed. No grand farewell. Just 5 musicians who had entered the room carrying expectations. And were leaving it carrying something far more valuable. Understanding. Outside, the first faint hint of dawn began to brighten the horizon. None of them realized it yet. But the walk to the front door, and the quiet words spoken there, would become the memory that outlived every song they had shared that night. The room had fallen silent once again. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word that truly mattered had already been spoken. Outside, the first light of dawn slowly painted the California sky with soft shades of gold. The night was over. The conversation was over. Yet none of the 5 men seemed ready to leave. For a few precious hours, the world had disappeared. There had been no headlines, no interviews, no applause, only music, and the rare comfort of being understood. Elvis slowly stood from his chair. He looked around the room as if trying to memorize it. The 5 guitars rested exactly where they had been placed hours earlier. But somehow, they no longer looked like instruments. They looked like witnesses. Witnesses to a conversation no audience would ever hear. John quietly picked up his jacket. Paul carefully placed a guitar pick on the table. George gently ran his fingers across the strings one last time. Ringo smiled to himself. I don't think we've played this honestly in a long time. Nobody laughed, because everyone knew he was right. There was something strangely freeing about playing for no audience. No expectations. No pressure. No critics waiting to judge every note. Just music. The reason all of them had started this journey in the first place. Elvis slowly walked toward the front door. The others followed, not because they were eager to leave, but because every unforgettable night must eventually become a memory. The hallway felt different now. When they had entered the house the evening before, every step had carried uncertainty. Now, every step carried gratitude. They reached the front door. Morning light poured inside. Fresh air swept gently through the house. For several long seconds, nobody reached for the handle. It almost felt as though opening the door would allow reality to rush back in. Finally, Elvis broke the silence. You know, his voice was calm. When I was a boy, I thought success meant being remembered forever. He smiled. I was wrong. The Beatles looked at him. Elvis continued. Being remembered isn't what matters. He slowly looked from one face to the next. What matters is leaving someone with the courage to keep creating after they've met you. The words settled over the room. John lowered his eyes. Paul quietly exhaled. George stood perfectly still. Even Ringo's smile disappeared. Because they realized that was exactly what Elvis had done for them years before. Without ever knowing it. Without ever meeting them. His music had given 4 ordinary boys from Liverpool permission to dream impossible dreams. John finally spoke. You probably don't realize it. He smiled softly. But before we ever stood on a stage, we spent countless nights trying to sound like you. Elvis laughed quietly. I've spent the whole evening listening to the sound of 4 men who no longer need to sound like anyone. Silence. Not an awkward silence. A beautiful one. The kind that only follows complete honesty. George stepped forward. There was something I wanted to tell you. Elvis nodded. George took a slow breath. When I was younger, I believed greatness meant becoming someone the whole world admired. He paused. Tonight, you taught me that greatness is remaining yourself after the whole world begins watching. For the first time that night, the confidence disappeared from Elvis's face. His eyes softened. There was no answer, only a quiet nod. Some compliments are too honest for words. Paul extended his hand, then stopped. Instead, he pulled Elvis into a brief embrace. Not between celebrities, between musicians, between one generation and the next. John followed, then George, then Ringo. No cameras captured the moment. No photographer stood nearby. History would never print that image. Yet perhaps it was the truest photograph of the entire night. 5 men. No audience. No performance. Only gratitude. Eventually, the front door opened. Cool morning air rushed inside. Birds had begun singing somewhere beyond the trees. The world was waking up. Cars would soon fill the streets. Reporters would begin searching for stories. Fans would continue believing that fame looked glamorous. None of them would ever know what had happened inside this quiet house. The Beatles stepped outside. Halfway to the waiting car, John stopped. He turned around. Elvis was still standing in the doorway. Not waving. Simply watching them leave. John looked at the man who had unknowingly changed the course of his life years earlier. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a superstar. The smile of a grateful student. "We came here hopping to meet the king," he said quietly. "But kings sit on thrones." He looked back one last time. What we found was the man who reminded us why music was never meant to build thrones in the first place. It was meant to build bridges. No one spoke. They didn't need to, because every one of them felt the truth in those words. The car slowly disappeared down the long driveway. Elvis remained standing at the doorway until it vanished beyond the gates. Only then did he step back inside. The house became silent once more. He walked into the music room. 5 chairs. 5 empty glasses. 5 guitars. One of them still rested slightly out of place. Elvis smiled. He didn't move it. Some moments deserve to leave a mark. Years turned into decades. Albums became timeless. Concerts became legend. The world remembered the records they sold, the awards they collected, the crowds that filled entire cities. But history rarely remembers the quiet moments that shape extraordinary lives. It doesn't remember the conversations that restore tired hearts. It doesn't remember the silence between songs. It doesn't remember the morning when 5 of the greatest musicians in history quietly reminded one another why they had fallen in love with music. Perhaps that is because the greatest performances are not always given beneath bright lights. Sometimes, the most important audience is only one person sitting across the room. One conversation. One evening. One quiet house. And 5 musicians who arrived carrying the weight of their crowns, but left carrying something far more valuable. Perspective. Because fame fades. Applause fades. Even legends eventually become history. But the reason an artist creates, if protected, can outlive every chart, every headline, every standing ovation. And maybe that is why the world never truly understood what happened that night. People believed the Beatles met Elvis Presley. The truth was far simpler. 5 musicians met one another. 5 dreamers remembered who they had been before the world knew their names. And as the sun climbed higher above California, the music they carried inside them sounded just a little different. Not louder. Not greater. Just more honest.